Looking at the picture, you can see the fourth event that we're going to look at, which is where Jesus feeds the 5,000 plus people. This is the only miracle found in all four Gospels. The event is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. The book of Mark, chapter 6, verses 32 through 44, and the book of Luke, chapter 9, verses 11 through 17. But we're going to use John's account, which is found in the book of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. Let's read it together. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, and number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." We see in verse 1 that John refers to the Sea of Galilee as the Sea of Tiberias. Tiberias was a city built in 20 AD on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee by Herod Antipas, and named in honor of Tiberius Caesar, who was the Roman emperor from 14 through 37 AD. We see in verse 2 that a great multitude followed Jesus. Mark's account tells us that Jesus was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep having no shepherd. So he healed their sick and began to teach them many things. The signs that John refers to here are simply miracles. Jesus was wanting to get away from the crowd of people, so he went up to a mountain where he could spend a little time with his disciples. Verse 4 tells us that the Passover was near, which means there would have been a lot of Jews coming through the area as they headed to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. This event would have taken place in the area of Bethsaida. John tells us in verse 5 that Jesus saw the great multitude coming up the mountain towards them, so he asked Philip where they could buy some food so they could feed this great multitude. Jesus asked Philip this to test his faith because he already knew what he was going to do. Jesus probably asked Philip this because he was from the city of Bethsaida, and it would start Philip to thinking as to where he could get this much bread. And we see in verse 7 that Philip tells Jesus that 200 denarii worth of bread was not going to be enough to feed all these people. 200 denarii was about 6 to 8 months worth of wages, which would have been a lot of money. Not only was this a lot of money, of which they most likely did not have, Philip would have had a problem finding a place that had that much bread available, and it had taken too long to get someone to bake enough bread to feed this great multitude. We see in verse 8 and in verse 9 that Andrew brought this young boy to Jesus and told him this young boy had 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But Andrew tells Jesus that that's not enough to feed this great multitude. John tells us in verse 10 that there were 5,000 men there. Matthew tells us in his account that, in this miracle, that there were 5,000 men besides the women and the children. The number of people doesn't really matter because even if it had been just 500 people and Jesus fed all of them with just 2 small fish and 5 barley loaves, it would have still been a miraculous event. Jesus instructs his disciples to tell the crowd to sit down. Jesus may have told them this for 2 reasons. One, he knew they were very tired, so he wanted them to sit down and rest. Or 2, he knew he was getting ready to perform this miracle, and if all 5,000 plus were standing when he performed this miracle, it may have caused a frenzy as everyone rushed in to get something to eat. Mark's account says the people sat down in groups of 50 and 100. This way the people could be fed in an orderly way. We see in verse 11 that Jesus prays a prayer of thankfulness to his Father for the food they're about to eat. Then he turns those 2 small fish and 5 barley loaves into all-you-can-eat fish buffet. After the 5,000 plus had eaten all they could eat, Jesus tells his disciples to gather up what was left over. Jesus was probably doing this to show them not to waste anything. Even though it's not found in the scriptures, Jesus could have possibly been put into place the old saying, waste not, want not. The disciples gathered up enough of what was left over to fill 12 baskets up. These 12 baskets could have been symbolic to represent the 12 tribes of Israel or even the 12 apostles. We see in verse 14 that after Jesus' disciples saw this great multitude that Jesus performed, that they declared that this is truly the prophet who has come into the world. Notice that Jesus' disciples did not say a prophet, but rather the prophet. This would have been the prophet that Moses talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, which would be Jesus. We can learn from this event that Jesus knows what our needs are, and even though we may never achieve fame and fortune as his children, he will never allow us to go hungry. As David said in the book of Psalm, chapter 37:25, I have been young, and now I'm old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his descendants begging for bread. Just click on the video that says The Ministry of Jesus on and around the Sea of Galilee, Part 5, to continue.